What's up, y'all? My name is JR, and for those of you who don't already know, I'm a huge movie and TV nerd. If you're new here, I appreciate you taking the time to check out my channel. I hope you'll consider sticking around and joining the film community I'm trying to build here on YouTube. So in today's video, I'm going to be talking about Ryan Coogler's supernatural horror film, Sinners, and how telling the story in non-linear fashion affected the story overall. And just so you guys know, this video will contain spoilers, so if you haven't gotten around to seeing this movie yet, and you don't want to know anything that happens in it, you might want to exit this video now. And with that being said, no more wasting time. Let's get into it. So, if you are subscribed here to my channel, then you might know that a few days back, I published my reaction and review video for Ryan Coogler's latest film, Sinners. And in that video, I gave the film a 95% or 9.5 out of 10 if you're thinking IMDb score. Well, apparently I've angered some folks in my community because, according to them, the movie was perfect. And I have somehow offended Ryan Coogler and Michael B. Jordan by not saying so. So I thought it might be necessary to go back and talk about exactly how Coogler's choice to abandon the typical 3-act structure of his screenplay negatively impacted the score I gave the film, so that people can have a better understanding of what screenplays are supposed to look like, what they're supposed to do, and even more so, how I watch movies. And really, how all of you do too, whether you realize it or not. Now, first of all, Coogler starts the film with what we'll call the beginning of the film's epilogue, right? When Sammy stumbles into his father's church in the middle of his sermon, covered in blood, with only the neck of his prized guitar in hand, what this does, from a narrative perspective, is it gives Sammy a nice fresh suit of plot armor in a horror film. Now, I'm not saying that the scene isn't necessary as it pertains to the plot overall, but because of where the scene is positioned in the story, we now know that whatever takes place during the story, Sammy, the film's main character, will not be in any mortal danger moving forward. Now, that lowers the level of tension that can naturally be produced throughout the story because Sammy's physical well-being has now been assured. Now, I told you guys in the previous Sinners video that the story here is told in non-linear order. But let's take Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill, for example. Another story that is told out of sequence over the course of 2 films even. Now, I want you to imagine, if you can, if Tarantino had started the first movie with Beatrix Kiddo killing Bill in the very first scene, giving away the story's end before it ever even began. That's essentially what this was. And as a result, when the trouble finally rears its head in the story, we know that Sammy will be safe throughout. Now, this might seem like a small thing, but this narrative choice actually starts a snowball effect, because the very next thing that happens after we flash back to 24 hours earlier, that is, we get what would have been the break into 2 under normal circumstances. That being Sammy coming into his father's church as he practices his sermon to get his guitar in order that he can go off with his older cousins who are back from Chicago to perform at a juke joint that they're opening in the area. Now, this skips completely past what would have been the setup, catalyst, and the debate. The setup being us getting a chance to see what Sammy's day-to-day life was like. The catalyst being Smoke and Stack arriving back in town from Chicago and meeting up with Sammy to ask him if he will perform at their juke joint. The debate being Sammy taking time to consider their proposal, despite his father's objection. But we don't get any of that here because of the narrative structure that Coogler chooses to tell the story. Now, the snowball effect this had on the story is that it stretched out what would have been the second act, the process of Smoke and Stack preparing to open their juke joint. And the biggest thing this affected was how long it took before we're even introduced to, for the first time, Remick, the story's villain, which happened about 45 minutes into the film, in case you were wondering. And, in case you were wondering, that's just way too long to wait to see vampires in a vampire movie. Now, once the story got to the point, I thought it moved along just fine. Even though, like I said, Sammy was the main target of Remick and his minions, But we already knew he was safe, so it kind of doesn't matter, narratively speaking, right? But the action in the third part of the film is what a lot of us came to see, leading up to the climax we all knew was coming, again, because the climax had already been telegraphed by Coogler in the story's beginning. Now, some of you might be asking yourself what the film would have looked like if Coogler had told the story in a more traditional fashion. Well, I got time today, so let's take a look at that. Now, I'm going to be spitballing a bit here, based purely on the story that we all watched, as it were. So keep that in mind as I map this bad boy out by the beats. So let's say the opening image would have been Sammy waking up in his bed early in the morning, right? Simple enough. That would take us to the setup, which could have been Sammy eating an early breakfast and then doing his chores. Then let's say that while all this is happening, Smoke and Stack ride into town from Chicago, their truck full of spirits, their pockets full of money, and a plan. They would stop by the mill and buy it from Hogwood and make their threats about him and his KKK friends coming on their land, pow, 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 all that kind of stuff, right? Because that's foreshadowing, so we need that. They would then go to hire Cornbread to be the bouncer for their juke night, right? Now, back at Sammy's house, he gets sent into town, let's just say, to run an errand for his mother, right? And while he's there, he encounters his cousins, who are getting their stuff together for their grand opening and stopping people from taking things out the back of their truck by using lethal force, as we saw in the actual film. Now, this would be the part where we would also meet the characters Grace and Bo, who are the shopkeepers, right? And Mary, who is Stack's, ex, and my man Delta Slim, right? The harmonica player, Delroy Lindo, my man. Now, they see Sammy maybe coming from whatever he needed to buy for his mom or get for his mother or whatever, and they explain that they were about to come find him because they want him to play and perform at their juke joint. While they're talking, Sammy meets Pearline. He also warns that his father would not approve of his performing at their club and that he needs to think about it. The twins would then insist that they would be to the house later to get his answer. Now, this would take us to the debate, which would basically consist of Sammy deciding what to do. He would take whatever he picked up for his mother back home, while the twins head to Miss Annie's place, where Smoke would pay respects to his deceased child, and then apparently have sex with Annie with all their clothes on for 5 seconds or so, because I don't know how this story could have been told without that. Now, the break into two would be Sammy knowing that Pearline would be at the juke joint and deciding to perform there, right? And the twins picking him up from home and taking him to the church to get his guitar while his father practices his sermon, right? This was the first real scene of the movie that we actually saw. And this would be where we would get the equally foreshadowy line, if you dance too long with the devil, one day he's going to follow you home. Sammy would then take his guitar and leave with his cousins, headed back to the mill. Now, at the same time, we would see Remick appear out of nowhere, being chased by the Native Americans to Bert and Jones' place, where we know they let him inside and he turns them both into vampires. Now, Act 2 would consist of Sammy, the twins, and all their hired hands and volunteers transforming the mill into their party spot, and the party eventually starting. Now, Mary shows up, causing a ruckus, and eventually Sammy performs. Everybody is having a good time as Sammy takes Pearline to the back and gets his buffet on, if you will, right? A buffet of love. And this would be the film's midpoint. Because Sammy was hungry. Y'all got to understand, bro. He was hungry. Now, the bad guys close in when Remick, Bert, and Jones show up at the juke and try to get invited inside, right? They got money to spend. Now, they are rebuffed, and Mary offers to go outside to see exactly what it is they want. Now, as she tries to leave, she gets attacked by Remick and turned into a vampire herself before being let back inside by Cornbread, because, he don't know what's going on, before he goes off to take a whiz in the woods. Once back inside, Mary talks Stack into taking her to the back room for Mr. Nasty Time, where she turns him into a vampire. Smoke finds Mary with his brother, and he shoots her a few times. She runs off, and Cornbread reappears and asks to be let back in. But Annie tells Smoke not to invite him inside. Cornbread tries to then get paid for his services, and when Smoke attempts to give him the money, because he just had to give him the money even though something's clearly wrong, right? Cornbread tries to bite him. So Smoke gets back inside safely, closing the door, and before his brother then asks to be let out of the back room, right? That kind of feel like a plot hole to me in the actual film, but we'll just skip that for now. That's not what this part of the video is about. Because, I mean, he's already inside the mill. I don't understand, but okay. Now, the all is lost section is where Annie explains that they have to hold on till sunrise and that Smoke should kill her if she's turned into a vampire. Sammy remembers that his father said, about the devil and all that kind of stuff in his music. Bo, for some reason, goes outside, because of course he does, right? And he gets turned into a vampire, then asked to come back in. Remick threatens Grace's daughter and explains that he's here for Sammy, that his gift will help him get back to where he came from to see his people again. We also find out that Hogwood set the twins up, that he is indeed in the clan, right? Now, the group starts to sing Pick Poor Robin Clean. Meanwhile, it's kind of ominous, but okay. Meanwhile, Grace becomes incensed and invites the vampires inside. Because of course she does. The vampires storm the juke and violence ensues. And during the melee, Stack turns Annie into a vampire and Smoke, unfortunately, has to kill her. Now, Stack and Mary, seeing this, become upset and they leave. That was a weird part of the film. I didn't really get that. You're in there to do work. So when work gets done, I don't know why you'd be so surprised. But okay. Now, the Dark Night of the Soul would be Smoke mourning the loss of Annie, maybe in the back room, shutting in the back room with Sammy, as things calms down and the vampires regroup outside. But again, they've already been, invited in, so I don't know. This is the part that we didn't really get in the film, again, due to the non-traditional story structure, right? We didn't really get this part. Now, the break into 3 would be Smoke coming up with a new plan, a plan for them to escape the mill, that is, right? So it's no longer about holding the line. It's about let's get out of here, right? New plan, break into 3. Now, in the finale, Sammy and Smoke try to escape out the back as Delta Slim, my man Delta Slim, stays behind to fight off the horde. Pearline is then attacked and turned into a vampire. Meanwhile, the twins fight, right? Remick captures Sammy. Now, Sammy says the Lord's Prayer in response, right? Which was kind of ironic because, when your daddy said, hey, why don't you stay in this church? You're like, no, I got to go do this thing, right? Remick baptizes Sammy in a nearby lake as his vampire friends all join him and look on, right? Now, meanwhile, Smoke gets the upper hand in his fight with his brother, and he apologizes for failing to keep him safe. But, it does cut away from the fight, so you don't really get to see him, how the fight ends. Because back at the lake, Sammy stabs Remick with a piece of his guitar, and it damages him long enough for Smoke to show up, who was instructed how to deal with vampires by Annie, if you remember, to stake him. The other vampires cry out as the sun comes up over the trees and the daylight destroys them all, right? Remick eventually dies before Smoke sends Sammy home, telling him to bury the guitar, right? After all that, Smoke doesn't escort him home, he sends him home. Okay. So Smoke stays behind and deals with the impending clan threat as Hogwood and his homeboys do indeed show up, right? And Smoke kills them all, but is mortally wounded in the fight. And as he sits there, dying, he sees Annie again with their baby. And the final image would be the actual film's opening image, that being Sammy showing up at the church covered in blood during his father's sermon. Now, why does this matter, right? Why does it matter how he told the story? Because there's a reason why stories are structured the way they are, right? I mean, have you guys ever stopped to think about why all the movies that you watch kind of feel oddly similar, oddly familiar, right? It's because almost every Hollywood screenplay follows a very specific 3-act structure, regardless of the genre of said script, right? And before we get into that, let's take a moment to ask the question, what exactly is a story? Now, most definitions of story that you'll find explain it as simply an account of events, right? But I think a story is more a documentary of events that involves an opportunity for a change of some sort, right? Now, that doesn't mean that a change of any kind will actually take place, but usually it does. But even when it doesn't, said story would document why the change did not happen. That's the whole heart of a story. Now, that said, each of the acts in a screenplay serves a different logical and emotional purpose, right? Act 1 introduces the opportunity for change, right? Act 2 depicts the effort to achieve said change, and Act 3 reveals the outcome of that change. Now, by the end of the first act, we should understand who the story is about, what genre the story belongs to, what the main characters or characters want and or need, or what their goals are. What's preventing them from achieving their goals, and what happens if they don't achieve their goals. Or in other words, what the stakes are. And once we've received all that information, we understand who we're supposed to be rooting for, what we hope they will or won't do, learn, or achieve, and what genre expectations we should have for how the story will be told. Now, Act 2 depicts the main character's efforts to achieve the desired change. But if they were to succeed in changing right off the bat, that would make for a very, very, very short story, an unsatisfactory story. Also, an easy win might not feel earned, rendering the story maybe even potentially unworthy of even being told. That's why Act 2 is filled with complications that often force the main character or characters to change somehow in order that they can achieve the goal that they're in pursuit of. Now, it should also be noted that Act 2 is also the longest act of any movie, right? It usually takes up twice the time of Act 1 and Act 2. Act 1 and Act 3, combined. And structurally, the two main anchor points during this act, as I described earlier, as it pertains to this particular film in Act 2 of a movie, are the midpoint and the reversal or crisis point, that being, the bad guys close in, right? Now, the midpoint is often a false conclusion, right? In which the character either seems to obtain a key victory or suffer a crucial defeat. So in this film, when Sammy plays and everybody loves it, he takes Pearline in the back and he, and gets his Pac-Man on, right? Everybody's happy. Everybody seems to have what they want, right? And then right after that, Remick is like, hey, dog, can you tell us where we can find some toothpaste, bro? You know what I'm saying? And that's the bad guys coming in like, oh, wait, everything's not all good. It's about to go left. You see what I'm saying? Shit's about to get real. Also, the emotional tone of the midpoint is often the opposite of whatever the emotional tone is going to be at the movie's conclusion. So, for example, in a film that's going to have a happy ending, the midpoint is often a minor catastrophe, if you will. Now, in a film with a sad ending, the midpoint is often a short-lived success, oftentimes very short. Now, after the midpoint, most films depict the main character or characters exhausting all of their options as they approach achieving their goal until they're left with just the one, right? Often succeeding by using the final option, which will require the main characters to overcome their internal flaws. Like, for example, when we look at romantic comedies, right? The guy has to, in the Breaking the Three, the guy's, down low, the girl that's left him, and then he has to decide, you know what, I'm going to give this one more chance. I'm going to do this grand thing. I'm just going to show her how much she mean to me. I'm going to run through the train station, holding a sign, show up at the house with the boombox over my head, and that's going to get it, right? Now, the series of struggles typically results in the main characters being pushed to their lowest point. All seems lost. And attaining their goals seem more impossible than ever, like I just said, right? Only at this point does the main character finally find their inner strength, right? Their inner chi. They need to make a crucial change that enables them to finally prevail over whatever their obstacle might be, right? Act 3 reveals the outcome of the main character's efforts to achieve or prevent the change from taking place. From a structural standpoint, Act 3 contains only one specific benchmark, that being the climax or the final conflict, right? The final boss. In Act 3, the main character usually has just one option left to achieve their goal. This sets them on a collision course in which they'll be forced to kind of face the primary antagonist, whoever that might be, and often come face to face with their own internal demons as well, right? And they will either succeed or fail. And their success or their failure will have some sort of consequence. Maybe even for everybody around them, right? Now, as for the outcome of the story itself, it could be positive or negative, right? If a change occurs, then a new normal will be established, which could be better or worse than the way things were before. Likewise, if the change doesn't occur, then the old normal will continue, and whether that's a good or bad thing depends on the specific nature of the change that did or did not occur, right? In simple terms, this means that there are only 4 possible outcomes for a story, right? For any story. A positive change might happen, and it does. A positive change might happen, and it doesn't. A negative change might happen, and it doesn't. Or a negative change might happen, and it does. Now, does a movie have to follow the 3-act structure? Technically, no. I've told you guys over and over and over, as a screenwriter, you're basically God in the world you're creating, right? And technically speaking, you can do whatever you want. This is a subjective medium, right? You can do whatever you want. But 3-act structure has become so common in Hollywood that using it essentially is essentially the obligation of every professional screenwriter, certainly. While not following it might prove you to either be an absolute amateur who has no earthly idea what they're doing, or a rebellious genius who kind of bucked the system in the name of artistic integrity, right? But it is a risk, right? As a screenwriter, you know, if you don't follow the 3-act structure, especially in your first couple of scripts, you take a huge risk in terms of being taken seriously, right? And I'm telling you guys, I know this for an absolute fact because the first 4 or 5 scripts that I wrote were absolute garbage, right? They will never see the light of day. I chalk that up to me basically learning how to write a script, right? And when I let people read them, they were just like, yeah, boss, this ain't it, right? And while this could all seem unfair, you know, considering the process that a typical script takes while being discovered, if you were a studio script reader, would you risk your own reputation by recommending a producer should spend millions of dollars to make a movie from a screenplay that doesn't follow the same structure as nearly every other movie that's ever been made? Well, no, of course not, right? They've been making movies like this for over 100 years for a reason, right? For a reason. And the same structure that also happens to be the one producer, director, or crews already know how to schedule and budget for production. So this even becomes a logistical issue as well, right? So again, no, you would not do that. Thus, even if you want to break all the 3-act structure rules when you write your own unconventional script, it still helps to know what the rules are, why they exist, and why nearly every movie that gets made follows them, right? I've always said to you guys that in any kind of creative endeavor, there are rules, whether you're writing, scoring, arranging music, whether you're taking photos, whether you're painting, drawing, and even filmmaking, right? You have to learn the rules first because some of the rules can be bent and some of the rules can be broken, but you have to know what the rules are and why they exist first so that when you decide to do whatever it is you're going to do, you can explain it to somebody who asks, right? If someone asks you, hey, why didn't you follow the 3-act structure? You had better have an answer. Because if you don't, they go, oh, this dude just don't know what he's doing. Now, having said all that, at this point, Ryan Coogler is certainly not an amateur, which is why he could get away with something like this. But say, for example, if I myself tried to give this script to an agent, a manager, or worse, a Hollywood producer, they would have simply given it back to me with the feedback being that it needed to be completely rewritten. Again, before you guys tell me that I don't know what I'm saying, these are things that have happened to me in the past. This is how I learned, right? By getting out there going, hey, I wrote this thing, and somebody going, oh man, yeah, nah, let me explain to you what's wrong with this, right? And that's just how all this works, you know, whether you choose to accept it or not. Now, I originally gave this film a 95%, like I said earlier in this video, or 9.5 you're thinking IMDb score, right? And after having more time to think about it and I probably had 25 conversations, long, deep conversations about this film since it was released, I want to amend my score. It's the first time I've ever done this on my channel. So I'm going to give this film a 90% or 9.0 if you're thinking IMDb score, right? And listen, I want to be as clear as I possibly can. I did not necessarily like the fact that Coogler told this story out of order. But in saying that, I can admit that he more than made up for the things in the film that did not work quite as well with the things that did, right? Again, hear me when I say, I am not here to hate on Ryan Coogler. Ryan Coogler is literally the black filmmaker I would aspire to be. So this is not me hating on him. I can also admit that in 10 years, I think this film will be looked upon in the same vein as Jordan Peele's Get Out, right? Now, as for all the hoopla about the film's box office performances being portrayed, I don't necessarily get what everybody's so angry about, right? I mean, I get it. You kind of go, well, this negative publicity could affect the film's box office numbers, but I don't think it will, right? The film's going to do what the film's going to do in theaters, and it'll make it into the black or it won't. I don't think the film necessarily has to be a financial success to be seen as a creative one, which I want to be clear again. I think the film already is a creative success, right? But I do understand that the film needs to turn a profit for other reasons, reasons that might impact how many, people like Coogler, or even myself, get to make films like this one in the future. But we have to be able to talk about these films, especially in the black community, without it getting to the point where black folks are trying to cancel other black folks for simply stating the truth. That the movie was excellent. It just wasn't perfect. But what do you guys think? Have you had the chance to go see Sinners yet? If you have, what did you think about Coogler's decision to scramble the beats, if you will? Let me know in the comments. And for those of you that might be new to the channel, be sure to like and share this video. If you really like the content, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you'll be notified whenever I drop a new video. You can also now support the channel by leaving a super thanks. If you should be so inclined, I'd greatly appreciate it. Also, be sure to go and check out themaskscreenwriter.com for more television and film reviews and info on my upcoming film projects. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I got screenplays to write. And I'll catch y'all on the next video.